So today I want to talk about toys, but specifically I want to talk about 80s and 90s toys that were huge during Christmas time. So this is probably going to be no shock to you, but I think 80s and 90s toys are the best. I mean, if you grew up in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, you grew up during the time of the best toys ever. And that's probably why when my son was little, he didn't really play with toys the same way that I did. I mean, he did play with toys, but just not the same way that we did when we were kids. And it's because his toys just weren't as cool. And so today we're going to take a look at 10 toys that every kid had on their Christmas list during the 80s and 90s.
Number 10, the Rubiks Cube.
Now the Rubiks Cube probably doesn't seem too exciting these days, especially for a kid growing up nowadays. But the Rubiks Cube was actually the best-selling toy of 1980. And not just 1980, but it was actually the best-selling toy of the entire decade. And I'm pretty shocked by that. I actually just found that out. The Rubiks Cube was invented by Erno Rubik in 1975, and it was first released in Hungary. And in its first 2 years, it sold 100 million units. Not too bad. But between 1980 and 2020, it sold 450 million units. Now, when the Rubiks Cube was at its prime throughout the 1980s, its average retail price was $1.99, which is really good and probably another reason why it was such a hot Christmas item. Now, of course, everybody's familiar with the Rubiks Cube. That was the most popular one, but they did put out other puzzles, and I know for sure that I had this one, and I wasn't able to solve that or the cube. And honestly, in my opinion, it is not natural to be able to solve the Rubiks Cube. I mean, that thing is impossible. I remember many years ago, a good friend of ours, she was at our house babysitting my son when he was really little, and I had a Rubiks Cube with some of my other 80s toys. And when we came home, my Rubiks Cube was sitting on the coffee table and it had been solved. And our friend said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I hope you don't mind. I solved your Rubiks Cube." And I said, "Get out of the house now and never come back because something is wrong with you."
Number 9, Smurfs.
So Smurfs figurines were first produced in Germany in 1965, but the Smurfs cartoon first premiered on September 12th, 1981, which would have been my second birthday. I had no idea that Smurfs premiered on my birthday. So for whatever reason, the Smurfs became huge in the 1980s and everybody had those little Smurfs figurines. I know I had a few. Pretty much every house that I remember going to in the 1980s had some of those little Smurfs figurines. And not only the figurines, but all kinds of other Smurfs merchandise was flying off the shelves. I know I had Smurfs curtains and Smurfs bed sheets. I actually still had my Smurfs curtains when my wife and I first started dating. I wish I still had those. But so yeah, there was a lot of Smurfs merchandise and kids wanted that stuff for Christmas. Now at one point the Smurfs were so huge that between now and 1965, they've sold 300 million of those little Smurfs figurines.
Number 8, My Little Pony.
So My Little Ponies were huge in the 1980s. Every little girl wanted a My Little Pony, and probably some little boys too. That's why today we have bronies.
I'm a pony and I'm proud to be a girl.
So Generation 1 of My Little Pony came out in 1982, and it consisted of just 6 ponies. Of course, there was a cartoon to go along with it, like most toys in the 80s. And throughout the 1980s, they sold over 150 million My Little Ponies. And My Little Pony is something that's still huge today. I mean, they have conventions for it still today in 2023.
Number 7, Jenga.
So Jenga was created in England by Leslie Scott, who grew up in England and East Africa. It was originally a game created by her family, and in Swahili, Kojinga means to build. Makes sense? So in 1982, they started selling Jenga at toy fairs, and in 1985, they had the first commercial launch in Canada. In 1986, they sold 400,000 units at the Toronto Toy Show. Not too bad. In 1987, Hasbro released it under the Milton Bradley name, and they sold 4 million units between 1987 and 2000. But yeah, definitely throughout the 80s and 90s, that was a really big Christmas item, and it's still really big today. I know my family still loves breaking out the Jenga and playing it every once in a while.
Number 6. G.I. Joe.
G.I. Joe, the real American hero. Every kid in the 80s loved G.I. Joe. Every kid wanted those toys, especially the aircraft carrier. Nobody actually had, I mean, some kids had that aircraft carrier. I didn't know anybody that had one, but I definitely loved G.I. Joe, the toys and the cartoon. I actually remember watching G.I. Joe every morning while eating my cereal before school. Now, I'm sure most of you know G.I. Joe is not originally an 80s toy. The figures originally came out in 1963, but it was a much bigger 12-inch action figure. And then the smaller action figure that we're more familiar with, that came out in 1982, but it didn't become popular until 1986, and that's because the cartoon series came out in 1985. And of course, we all know that's what 80s cartoons were. They were basically just big commercials for toys. Now, one thing about those G.I. Joe commercials from the 80s, and really most toy commercials from the 80s, is they always had the kids playing with the toys on these elaborate sets with mountains and rivers and snow and forests, and it looked so cool, but then you would get it home and you'd be playing with the toy in your bedroom and you'd be like, why does this not seem as cool as in the commercial? But the toys were great, the cartoon was great, the PSAs at the end of the cartoon were great, and those PSAs ended up becoming an internet sensation when someone did voiceovers on them, turning them into this.
Pork chop sandwiches.
To me come off, what's me nearly dead with laugh. I watch the people rush the door like Cabbage. Chuck up, fun time there, time for the.
Give him the stick. Don't give him the stick.
Do you know my dad?
Oh. Number 5. Transformers.
These are the Transformers, one of the fastest selling toys in America. If you want one for your kids this Christmas, go now while stores have a good selection. Folks, these robots are hot. Get them by Thanksgiving weekend so you can give them at Christmas.
So I have a feeling that a lot of you would argue that Transformers was the biggest toy of the 1980s, and you definitely wouldn't be wrong to argue that. I don't know if it was the biggest toy of the 1980s, but it was definitely up there. Now, the Transformer toy was released by Hasbro in 1984. They adopted the toy from Japan, and the Transformers cartoon was released in September 1984, which of course boosted the sale of the toy, and Christmas time, every kid wanted a Transformer. Now, the average retail price of Transformers in the 1980s was around $4. Of course, that depends on which Transformer we're talking about. The bigger ones were a little bit more money. I know that I was lucky enough to have at least a couple of Transformers. I know I had Optimus Prime. I know I had Megatron. I actually have a really weird memory involving my Megatron. Now, this would have been when I was probably around 6 or 7 years old, and I just remember that I was walking all around the house frantically trying to find my Megatron. I had lost it, and I was looking everywhere, and I was telling my mom, I lost my Megatron, and she was like, well, you haven't left the house, so it has to be here somewhere. But I was going nuts trying to find this thing. I was freaking out, and then eventually I found my Megatron on the shelf in the refrigerator. I guess I was running around playing with it, and I stopped to get something to drink, and I set it down on the shelf in the refrigerator. That's just a weird memory that I have. That's my memory involving Transformers.
Number 4. Masters of the Universe.
So Masters of the Universe, or He-Man as some people refer to it. Of course, He-Man is the character, but some people just refer to the entire franchise as He-Man. I'm one of them. This is another one that could be argued was one of the biggest toys and cartoons of the 1980s, along with G.I. Joe as well. Now, the Masters of the Universe cartoon was created by Mattel in 1981, but the toys weren't released until 1982. Now, something that was a little unique about the He-Man action figures is they were 5.5 inches tall, a whole 2 inches taller than Star Wars or G.I. Joe action figures. And like I said, Masters of the Universe was huge throughout the 1980s. It was one of my favorites. I watched the cartoon every day. I had a bunch of the toys. I know at least a few different Christmases I received He-Man toys. There's pictures throughout the years of me opening He-Man toys on Christmas morning. I know that there was one Christmas in particular that I got Spydor. Now that's this guy right here. I also got a bunch of different figures that year. I know I got Stinkor. I got the leech guy with the suction cups. I can't remember his name right now. But I also got the slime pit. Does everybody remember the slime pit? That was that little pit with the claw that would come up and hold your enemy in place. And then you could dump the slime on their head, because at that time, slime was huge and they tried to incorporate it into like every 80s toy. But man, that slime pit was awesome. That was a toy that I still remember opening and being so excited about. Now I should mention that so far this list has been in no particular order. However, I did save what I think are the 3 biggest toys of Christmas time in the 1980s for last.
Number 3, Teddy Ruxpin.
So I'm sure you all remember Teddy Ruxpin. It was basically a teddy bear that told you stories. You would put cassette tapes in the back of Teddy Ruxpin, and then the mouth would move and the eyes would blink. And it was actually a really advanced toy for that time. I mean, no one had ever really seen a toy like that, and that's why everybody wanted it. The only problem is the cost of Teddy Ruxpin was between $59 and $79, and the cassette tapes were 13 bucks. And of course you had to get more cassette tapes, because after you already heard the story that was on the tape that came with Teddy Ruxpin, you had to get more stories. So you had to keep buying more and more cassette tapes. So it would get pretty costly. And I think that's what stopped a lot of people from getting a Teddy Ruxpin. So Teddy Ruxpin came out in 1985. Hasbro and Jim Henson both passed on it. Maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Eventually, Worlds of Wonder picked it up, and they had only 6 months to produce it to get it ready in time for Christmas. Now, in the first 30 days after its release, they sold 41,000 units. And from September to December of 1985, they brought in $93 million. That's $220 million in today's money. And I guess that $79 price tag didn't stop people after all, because they sold 800,000 units in 1985, and it was sold out for Christmas. Now, I remember that for whatever reason, I didn't really have interest in getting a Teddy Ruxpin. I mean, I thought they were cool because, like I said, you had never seen anything like that. But I know I didn't really want one. Maybe I thought that I was too old for a teddy bear or something. But I remember that my mom was always kind of a big kid, and she really wanted a Teddy Ruxpin, but there was no way that my dad was gonna spend 75 bucks on a talking teddy bear. I also remember that years later, my cousins got a Teddy Ruxpin, and that was the first time that I ever got to mess around with one. And I used to like to take theirs and put my rap tapes in it. I mean, there's nothing like Teddy Ruxpin doing iced tea.
Am a nightmare walking, psychopath talking, king of my jungle just...
Number 2, Nintendo Entertainment System.
The Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. Again, this is one that could be argued was one of the biggest toys of the 1980s. I mean, every kid had this on their Christmas list, and a few were even actually lucky enough to get it. So it was first released in Japan in 1983, and it was called Family Computer, or Famicom. It was released here in the States in October of 1985, and they sold over 61 million units. Now in 1986, they sold 1 million units, but they could have sold a lot more, but they didn't have enough inventory, and it was sold out everywhere during Christmas. Now the retail price of NES was $175 to $199, which really makes me wonder how we were able to afford one. Now I didn't get one for Christmas, and actually I didn't get one at all, but luckily for me, like I already mentioned, my mom was a big kid and she really wanted a Nintendo, so she ended up getting one for her birthday. And of course, I would get to play it, and then eventually she would get tired of it and I would get to play it a little bit more. So even though I didn't have one of my own, we did have one in the house. But before Nintendo, we had Atari, and I loved playing Pitfall and Q*bert and Burger Time. Now, Nintendo was a huge Christmas item around 1985 and 1986, but it stayed a huge Christmas item for many years to come because they kept releasing new stuff like Game Boy, which was another huge one. The Power Glove, that was another one that was really overhyped. Super Mario Bros. 3, I mean, there was really no end to the Nintendo stuff that kept getting released. Man, I remember I wanted a Power Glove so bad. They hyped that thing up so much, and it turned out to be not as cool as they had made it out to seem, but everybody really wanted one, and I was one of them. And I asked for a Power Glove for Christmas, and I told my parents how bad I wanted one, and I was so excited for Christmas morning, and I did not get a Power Glove. But my parents knew how much I wanted one, so instead they got me an NES game called Glove Ball, which was supposed to be played with the Power Glove.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
Number 1. Cabbage Patch Kids.
I'm sure a lot of you already knew what number 1 was going to be. You knew it was going to be Cabbage Patch Kids. If you were alive in the 1980s, you know what a huge fiasco the Cabbage Patch Kids were. Now you all remember the Cabbage Patch Kids, right? Those were those dolls that were ripping off the Garbage Pail Kids. Okay, in all seriousness, Cabbage Patch Kids were created by Martha Nelson Thomas, and in 1980, it appeared on a show called Real People. Now, the dolls first sold in the fall of 1983, and the Cabbage Patch dolls were the first ones, at least the first ones that I remember, to basically cause mini riots in the stores. Now, each store was only supplied with 200 to 500 dolls, but thousands of people were showing up to buy them, and that's what created the mini riots. I mean, thousands of people were showing up to get these dolls, and when the stores didn't have enough, people were trampling each other, they were beating each other, they were ripping dolls out of each other's hands.
A full-grown woman taking a doll out of a child's hand?
I mean, all that just to get a Cabbage Patch Kid. But they had to do it because every kid wanted one.
I got my doll! I got my doll!
All right, so maybe it wasn't just kids that wanted them. Now, believe it or not, 115 million dolls were sold worldwide, even though the retail price was around $40. Now that's a lot of money for a doll, especially in 1983. Now personally, I never understood the Cabbage Patch Kids phenomenon, and I still don't, but Garbage Pail Kids, now that's another story. So that's gonna do it for our list. Hopefully you were lucky enough to have at least a couple of those toys when you were younger, and even if you weren't, you were still lucky enough to grow up in the best time period ever. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.